Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the March edition of the Southeast Climate Monthly webinar, where we talk about the climate and special topics pertaining to the Southeast region. I'm Sandra Rain, the Regional Climatologist from the Southeast Regional Climate Center, and I will be giving a climate overview. Our guest speakers today are Todd Hamill from the Southeast River Forecast Center, who will provide a water resources overview, Pam Knox from the University of Georgia, who will give an agricultural impact update, and our special topics, CoCoRaHS, the value of citizen science observers, presented by Melissa Griffin from the South Carolina State Climate Office. We thank everyone for joining us. Just a reminder before we begin, type your questions in the question box at any time, and they will all be answered at the end. Also, an email with a YouTube link to this recording, as well as a link to the summary of today's webinar, will be sent out in the next day or two. Okay, let's talk about the climate. Temperatures over the past 30 days have been above average across most of the region. This was especially true from February 22nd to 25th, when temperatures surged more than 15 degrees above normal. There were 23 long-term stations that observed daily maximum temperature records on the 23rd, and a few stations observed or tied their warmest February day on record, including Augusta, Georgia at 88 degrees on the 24th, and the University of South Carolina in Columbia, South Carolina at 89 degrees on the 25th. Precipitation over the past 30 days has been below average across much of the region, with New Bern, North Carolina tying its driest February on record at only 1 inch of precipitation. Monthly precipitation totals range from 70 to less than 25% of normal in many locations across the Southeast, except in the Caribbean. In Puerto Rico, they've seen above average precipitation, with San Juan, Puerto Rico observing its wettest February on record with over 11 inches. So what did that mean for our winter season as a whole? Well, for much of the Southeast, it's been dry, with many areas reporting more than 2 inches below average, and some of parts of southern Alabama and the Florida Panhandle observing more than 7 inches below normal. This is common for a La Niña winter. The temperatures this season, although overall they trended about 3 degrees above normal, it's been a topsy-turvy season, with a warm December, a cool January, and then back to a warm February again. The warm season led to a record number of 70 and 80-degree days across many stations, including Richmond, Virginia, Lumberton, North Carolina, Wilmington, North Carolina, Macon, Georgia, Mobile, Alabama, and Pensacola, Florida. As we get closer to the spring season, the severe weather across the region really starts to pick up. Although this February was below average in terms of number of severe weather reports, it did bring about 3 EF2 tornadoes to Alabama on February 3rd. The strongest tornado occurred in Greene and Hale counties and had winds of 130 miles per hour. This tornado destroyed many homes and unfortunately caused 8 injuries and 1 fatality. Moving on to the ENSO update, we are still under a La Niña advisory, with a 77% chance of La Niña continuing from March through May, and a 56% chance of a transition to ENSO neutral sometime between May and July. The next update, however, comes out this Thursday, March 10th. The U.S. Drought Monitor continues to show some exceptional drought in the western part of the United States, and the outlook does not have it improving much over the month. Here in the Southeast, drought conditions have improved in the Caribbean, with moderate drought seen across a small portion of southern Puerto Rico and moderate to extreme drought across parts of the Virgin Islands. However, drought conditions have increased across the eastern Carolinas and parts of Florida. Unfortunately, the dry conditions are especially concerning for the fires in Florida, where many people have lost their homes already due to large wildfires burning in the Panhandle. The typical peak of the Florida fire season is in the spring months, and it's already looking more active than normal. And unfortunately, the drought is expected to expand across coverage in Florida and the eastern Carolinas into southern Georgia, in particular the Gulf area of Florida. The Caribbean, however, looks to remain the same for the rest of the month as far as drought conditions. For the next 3 months, we have the probability of seeing above normal temperatures across the region, with the probability of drier conditions in the southern part of the southern part of the region, and the probability of equal chances of wetter or drier conditions to the northern part. We are still seeing this typical La Niña pattern for winter. Well, typical La Niña winter pattern. For the March 12th through 16th outlook, there is a probability of below average temperatures for the region, as well as a probability of below average precipitation for most of the southeast. Speaking of precipitation, we should see some this week. The heaviest amounts will probably occur from Wednesday into Thursday, and that includes the Florida Panhandle. By the end of the week, much of the region will see upwards of 2 inches, and I'm sure we'll take what we can get. So to sum up, the southeast has had above average temperatures for the past 30 days. Precipitation has been below average for the southeast. Winter overall has been warm and dry. We continue to be under a La Niña advisory, and the new update comes out this Thursday. Moderate drought is observed in the eastern Carolinas and Florida and is expected to increase in coverage throughout the month. Precipitation is likely this week with below average temperatures by the weekend, and the next 3 months will likely be warmer than normal and relatively dry. And now I'll turn it over to Todd.
Thank you, Sandra. So I'll kind of reflect on all of the things Sandra talked about with respect to what it had, the effect it's had on the rivers, all the rainfall in the past. And you can see this is the 28-day average stream flow. On the left-hand side shows the gauges all across the southeast, and you can kind of see a similar pattern that we saw on the drought monitor, with some drought conditions in parts of South Carolina, and especially in eastern North Carolina and Virginia. And then as you move down into Georgia, you can see spotty areas of drought conditions. And then as we get into Alabama, it's a little bit more wet. And that, again, is, as Sandra mentioned, that's kind of the La Niña pattern, where we've had some wetness in North Georgia and northern Alabama. But as we get further south, it's been a little bit drier. And when we start to talk about Florida, it's kind of a mix, but for the most part, it is below normal. You can see that on the right-hand side as we look over the last year and a half or so. This is the time of year when we should be recharging the soils, and that's part of the reason we have had some rain, but it's been below normal. And as a whole over the southeast, we've just kind of stayed in the normal range, but are starting to dip down into the dry range as a whole over the southeast. So let's take a closer look at each of the different states and go to the next slide. So for Alabama, as we mentioned before, most of the state has stayed in the normal range and close to above normal. And again, that goes with how much rain we've had over the last during the winter months. We start to look at the Georgia stuff, and we had some good rains in parts of Georgia during January, but we've had enough rain that it kept things in the normal category, but we've started to dry out. And you can see that trend going down. That trend shouldn't be going down, it should be going up right now. This is the recharge season. We expect some good rains and the stream flows to be increasing this time of year, and right now that's going down. And when we go down to Florida, now granted, it's a little different from the rest of everything because it's dry season right now. And dry season and you've got a mix in the Panhandle. They're a little different than what the peninsula is, what the rest of Florida is. So we have to watch this carefully. However, we will show you that you can see that it's much drier in Florida than we would expect for this time of year. And so let's go ahead and move on to the Carolinas. So South Carolina, it has dropped off very quickly. We did have some rains in the January timeframe again, like we had in much of the southeast, that improved conditions and made them normal. But the heat and the dryness in South Carolina during February has really made things go more into drought, and much of the stream flow in South Carolina is decreasing. And then in North Carolina, you can see we're still close to normal, but a lot of that has to do with more upstate, all the rain in the top of the state moving down a little bit, and it's kept things pretty normal. As you get further west into the smaller basins that aren't affected by the rain in the mountains, we're seeing below normal in that area. And then for Virginia, it's sort of a similar thing. As you are further upstream and closer to the mountains, things are in much better shape. As you get closer to the coast, things aren't as in good shape. So it kind of balances out a little bit, which is why we remain in the normal category. So let's go ahead and move on to just what it looks like today in the Southeast. Typically during this time of year, we would expect to see 15 or 20 sites in the Southeast region that would be in flood for this time of year. It is early March, and during March, we typically expect a lot of floods. But as you can see, we only have 2 points in flood at the bottom of the Tombigbee Basin in Alabama. And so and that's just from recent rains up at the top of the basin, all coming into there. So it's taken some time. So we would typically expect to see flooding in this area. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide and look at our climatology for flooding. And we're in week 10, and as you can see, that's a peak for the Southeast. This is when we should be peaking. Again, it's when we should be seeing numerous floods across the Southeast, and we're just not seeing it right now. That's a little unusual, and but we peak now, but we still stay active for the next month or so, or we should stay active for the next month or so. The rainfalls coming this week should help things out a little bit. We don't want flooding, but we could use the water. So maybe a little bit of river rises and so forth would be beneficial to the area. So, and then we really start to taper off. So having this rain during this time of year to recharge soils and to replenish streams and so forth is a huge deal, and will start to become a bigger deal as we come out of this recharge season and start to dry out as we get later into the spring, where we don't typically see as much rain and quite as many floods, and we start having competition for the water from trees and from all the different things, and just from the heat. It gets warmer, and we start to take out a lot of the moisture from the soils. So this is the time we really do need to see some beneficial rainfall. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And so what we're expecting, well, we're near normal risk for river flooding, and you can understand why with the winter being pretty close to normal in Alabama and Mississippi and North Georgia, that a lot of those were probably normal for flooding in some of those areas, but below our typical flooding in Florida and in the Carolinas. And you know, it should have been obvious as I went through this. That's kind of what you were expecting when you saw this graphic. So let's go ahead and go to the overview graphic. And so you can see USGS stream flows are below normal, especially across the Carolinas, but also, you know, like creeping into Alabama, Georgia, and Florida a little bit. This time of year, stream flow is at its peak for much of the Southeast, and expect stream flows to continue below normal range for much of the Southeast, with some drought development likely through spring. And flooding is typically less than typical, but again, the rain over the next week could impact that some, and we do need that rain. So hopefully this will give us a little bit of a break and give us some water in the system. And that's all I have. And I think Pam is next.
Yes, good morning. Thanks for that great review. That water is going to be gold for us here in agriculture, I think. It's spring here in Athens. I drove by our horticulture farm this morning, and the peaches are blooming, and it's also pollen season. So if I sneeze, that will explain why. So let's jump right in. Some of the recent impacts of the conditions that Sandra described on agriculture are shown here. The corn is now being planted across a lot of the southern region. You have to have soil temperatures of, I think, 55 degrees or higher on a continual basis for you to really get any growth from corn that's being planted. It's been pretty dry, so some places they've had to water the ground to put in the soil moisture. It's not going to be a problem after this week. I don't think it'll probably be too wet to get into the fields, and all that cold rain is probably going to slow down any production. So for those who might be considering planting, you probably want to wait till after this rain goes through. Because it's been dry, we haven't had a lot of problems with pests or diseases this year. But the growers are monitoring carefully because you got to stay right on top of it. And, you know, especially for things like strawberries that really can cut into your yield if you start to have fungal issues. In northern areas where it's still been pretty cold. The trees are still dormant, so they're still doing some pruning. But here, as I mentioned, in Athens and everywhere south of here for sure, it's blooming. It's spring, and so they've stopped doing pruning now, and they're watching the blooms develop. The Vidalia onion crop is ahead of schedule this year, but they have an official harvest date, so they've been doing pretty well in the drier weather this year. Everybody in Georgia looks forward to that, and when they show up in the grocery stores, that's always exciting. And the livestock have been in pretty decent shape. Because it's been dry, there's been some problems with forage, and so they've had to do some feeding of hay. Things are starting to green up. You can see the pictures on the left. There is some early peaches that are blooming. That's a picture from South Carolina, but it certainly looks similar. Not all the varieties are blooming yet. Peaches, like any other crop, have early varieties and late varieties. The early varieties are the ones that are going to really be threatened, I think, by the frost this weekend. But it's not clear yet how bad it's going to be. Something certainly to keep in mind. And the bottom picture there is from Lisa Baxter, our forage specialist here at UGA, showing that Bermuda grass is starting to emerge. That means you can't do any more burning, and you can't fertilize because you start to introduce toxicity into the grass. And so it's spring, the grass is growing as well as everything else. If we go on, many areas have still seen frost in the last couple of weeks. I'll show you on the next slide that we're not at the end of frost season yet for sure. But really most of Florida now, since that frost at the end of January has gone by, has not seen a frost since then. Unlikely that they're going to have frost again, but it's still possible. And this weekend is going to be a real test of that as well. If we go on, there we go. This is a map that I've been showing for the last few months of the last spring frost dates. We're in early March, so we're the light green right now, and you can see that the center map, which shows the average last frost date, this week is really through most of central Georgia, coastal South Carolina, and south central Alabama. Of course, if you're farther north than that, you probably haven't seen the last frost yet. It'll be a while yet before that happens. But we're not out of the woods for a lot of the region, and so that's going to be something to keep in mind. As I said, probably this weekend we'll see another frost. If we go on, one of the things that I thought was interesting is a story that I saw this week about forest fires in the Florida Panhandle. You might remember back in 2018, Hurricane Michael came on shore, and it really devastated the forest down there. And nobody knew what to do with all those downed trees, so they left them sit there. And now those trees are contributing to the forest fires. They've had a long time to sit there and decay and dry out. And so some of those forest fires are being attributed to both the drought conditions and the tree debris that's left. So, some of these storms can have lasting impacts that are more than just the immediate impact right after the storm. And that's something to keep in mind. If we go on. Just looking at the peaches, of course, if they're blooming now, you're not too worried about chill hours, except in the northern parts of the region. We can see that the summary shows that, and this is for Peach County, which is in central Georgia, the total number of chill hours this year is not going to be as much as last year, and certainly well below the long-term average, which is shown there in gold. That seems to be the trend, and so that's something that farmers that are thinking about putting in new trees will have to consider. Maybe they'll have to pick varieties that require fewer chill hours in the future. If we go on, the soil temperature, this was as of this weekend, so it's been quite dry. I expect that to change quite a bit as the week progresses and we have this front that's stalled over us. And you can see soil temperatures there from the Georgia Weather Network show that a lot of the southern Georgia is well into the 60s. So that is something that allows for planting of warm season crops like corn, as long as you know it's not going to get cold again. And that's, if you know it's going to get cold again, then you might want to hold off a little bit. But we're definitely reaching the planting season for a lot of the southern part of Georgia for sure, and of course the associated regions in Alabama, South Carolina, and Point South. All right. There we go. If we look across the next 2 weeks, Sandra showed the 1 week rain. This is the 2 week rain from one of the models, the GFS model. And you can see that we're going to see quite a change from the last couple of weeks of being so dry, with the front that moved through, another front coming through later this week is going to be the focus of a lot of rain, which we need, but it's going to cause problems for people who want to get out in the field, and it's going to cool off the soil temperatures a bit. I think overall the farmers would be happy to see the moisture at this point, because whatever we get now, once the growing season starts, the plants come out of dormancy, they start to really suck water out of the soils, and so precipitation is really just enough to keep up. And so whatever we can get is a great thing. And I will mention also the potential for frost, and yes, no, next weekend for some areas, possibly as far south as the Georgia-Florida border. Something to keep in mind. Certainly areas north of that would likely to see freeze, maybe not a hard freeze. So if you have crops that are already in the ground and are sensitive to frost, you're going to really want to watch that carefully, I think, especially Saturday night into Sunday. And I noticed this morning that there was even a potential for some snow in far northern Georgia. And so for those of you who are CoCoRaHS observers, and Melissa will talk about this more, you might even need to get out your snowboard. So let's go on to the next slide, my summary slide. Warmer weather has led to the peach blossoms in South Carolina, here in Athens, and the growth of Bermuda grass, all the signs of really second spring. Dry conditions have resulted in little disease and pest pressures so far, but have caused some problems for forage and small grains. The stalled front that's going to drape along the coast this week will probably drop up to several inches of rain, but it will improve drought conditions in a lot of areas, except for southern Florida, which is in their dry season, as Todd pointed out. Temperatures will be cool because we'll have that cold rain and we'll have a lot of clouds, but it looks like it's going to warm up again after that passes, and so we should be going back into warmer conditions relatively soon. And we're still likely to see some frost this weekend, and it might not be the last one of the year. We'll just have to watch for that. So with that, I will end, and I will pass it over to Melissa.
Okay, and I'd like to introduce our special topic speaker, Melissa Griffin from the South Carolina State Climate Office, and she is going to be talking about CoCoRaHS and the value of citizen science observers. And this is a really, really unique program. So take it away, Melissa.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk early in March, because the program I'm going to talk to you about today, CoCoRaHS, is in the middle of our annual March recruitment campaign. So hopefully if something you see that I mentioned today during today's talk, it grabs your attention, it makes you want to be a part of this program. We're looking for signups, not just here in the Southeast, but across the entire US. So if you haven't met me before, this is me. I am Cuckoo for CoCoRaHS, so much so that I will dress up as a water droplet and attend different type of functions just to get people energized and enthusiastic about being part of this particular project. Citizen science is not something that is new to the weather industry. It's been going on for a really long time, and I'm going to talk about that. But there are some important things about citizen science that make it very unique, and there's like 5 different things I kind of want to touch on. The first one is citizen science can give us new perspective on physical sciences just by crowdsourcing different information. We're able to reach the general public and gain that buy-in by having them become part of the process. So it's not just them on the outside looking in, but they actually feel like they're involved in the science that's going on in their local community. Probably number 3 is one of my favorite. You get to look at the knowledge of the participants of the citizen science programs. They lived in areas for a really long time. They kind of have an understanding about their environments around them, their microclimates, and that information is pretty vital. And I'm going to give some explanations on and some examples of that in a little bit. Again, like I said, crowdsourcing information, you can fill in the gaps. It's one of the great things about CoCoRaHS is filling in those gaps where we don't have observations or we have those limited resources. And that information comes together and it's helpful for everything at the local, the state, you know, the regional level. It could be with disaster planning, it could be with disaster response, or it could be any type of mandate or future hazard mitigation that's going on. So the first example is not necessarily citizen science weather related. It's not necessarily CoCoRaHS. It's actually the National Weather Service Cooperative Weather Weather Observer Program. This program actually came out of the Organic Act in 1890. And the goal of the program was to provide meteorological data and support to the National Weather Service, while also monitoring the nation's climate trends and the variability in the climate. And even before the Organic Act in 1890, weather observations were being made by the U.S. Army Signal Service, the Surgeon Generals located at these forts, diaries. I mean, this goes back in time. So the idea of citizen science being a new venture, it's been there. It's just maybe hasn't been as promoted as much. So we're going to talk about CoCoRaHS, which is a really cool acronym for Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network. CoCoRaHS got started as the result of the Fort Collins flood in 1997. This particular flood caused about $190 million in damages in the Fort Collins area. About $125 million of that was just to the campus of Colorado State University, where they lost a good portion of their archives. You can kind of see it in that upper right-hand picture, the library, all of that lost knowledge. Unfortunately, 5 people lost their lives. There were 180 water rescues and 40 people were injured. The interesting thing about this was the official National Weather Service rain gauge in Fort Collins only recorded 2 inches of rain in this particular event. And after this event happened, they did a bucket survey of the Fort Collins area, and you can kind of see on the right-hand side of the screen the difference between what fell near in the foothills of the mountains, up to 14.5 inches of rain to about 2 inches of rain, and that distance is a 6-mile difference. So this was kind of the idea is, you know, rainfall is so varied. We don't have sensors everywhere. So maybe if we tapped into that enthusiasm for weather and observing weather and tracking weather, maybe we can make a difference. And so what started originally as the Colorado Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network. So this is just kind of a footprint to give you an idea. Each one of those dots represents a station that had made a report on March 8th, 2002. Eventually spread to become a nationwide and even an internationally recognized citizen science project. So all 50 states have CoCoRaHS observers. We have CoCoRaHS observers in Canada, CoCoRaHS observers in the Bahamas, and we also have CoCoRaHS observers in Jamaica. So this has really become kind of a really neat, interesting, and probably one of the more successful citizen science projects that is out there today. I want to kind of give an example of how this has been helpful. And so since I'm in South Carolina, I'm going to kind of show you some of the differences. So this is the National Weather Service Cooperative Station Network in South Carolina. Each one of those blue dots represents an active station. And unfortunately, all of the open red circles are stations that have closed over the years. So if you just kind of look, you can see that there are some gaps within the network here, just in a small state like South Carolina. So you can imagine in some of the larger states in the Southeast, you know, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, North Carolina, Texas, just the big footprint, there's always going to be a gap. And what CoCoRaHS has done, and the ability for us to put these rain gauges into the hands of those people who are interested in this particular program, has really helped us fill in the gaps. So this is just a zoom in on all of the active stations. And when I did this, I actually pulled stations that had given at least one observation in 2022. So you can see that they really do kind of help fill in those gaps. CoCoRaHS started here in South Carolina in 2008, and since 2008, we have 73 observers that have made rainfall observations over the last 14 years. And since 2016, 354 observers that have continued to stay with the program. So what is the value of having this data? I mean, you can see there are clusters in some of the populated areas, but you can also see there are just some random rain gauges and some stations in some of these, you know, more rural areas. And so what I'd like to do is kind of, first of all, show the people behind these particular programs. So you can see some of the CoCoRaHS observers, some of our National Weather Co-op observers, and some of, I mean, we have been very fortunate to have a couple of Jefferson Award winners here in the state of South Carolina, Family Heritage Award winners for the National Weather Service program. I've gotten some schools involved in doing CoCoRaHS observations, and which ties great into any type of science and weather-related educational standard. Lacey is the top picture up there. He's been with the program since 2008, and next to her, CoCoRaHS rain gauge, she's also been with the program since 2008. So I just kind of want to give you some examples of the impact that CoCoRaHS has had here across the Southeast. Most of the stations in the Southeast started CoCoRaHS between 2006 and 2008. So that's where I'm going to start this kind of is kind of in where we got started with CoCoRaHS and the benefits of that. So the first thing I want to talk about is the 2006-2008 drought that we had here in the Southeast. Probably one of the more significant droughts that we've had in recent years here. Almost 36% of the Southeast was in a D4 drought at this particular time period. And we had very limited CoCoRaHS observers in South Carolina and in Georgia. We had some in Florida at the time, and even some in North Carolina. And as they were making their observations, one of the great things, in addition to having that quantitative data, you also got qualitative data from these observations. So not only were we getting the total precipitation amounts, but we were also getting the comments. And the comments from the CoCoRaHS observers have a wealth of information and provide a lot more detail that can really help, especially when it comes to different things like the U.S. Drought Monitor and drought declaration. So these are some examples of some of the comments that were made by CoCoRaHS observers in 2007, in December of 2007. And the idea of these, the impact that these comments could have later fueled an extension of this particular project that I'm going to give an example a little bit later on. But some of the ones that I liked, hallelujah, it rained a lot. You know, there are other ones in there that talk about, you know, the roadside ditches finally have, you know, standing water inside of them. You know, the total year-to-date rainfall from a station in Sumter, 32 inches. The state average rainfall for South Carolina is about 48 inches. So you're looking at almost a deficit of about 16 inches in the year. And that kind of puts some things into perspective when you were looking at these drought conditions. And the impact that they had is, many of us on the line, we understand weather and water do not stop at state boundaries or county boundaries, and they're really important when it comes to watersheds. So this is the Apalachicola, Chattahoochee, Flint watershed, the ACF basin that gets talked a lot about on some of these calls. And it's interesting because all of the water starts towards the Lake Sidney Lanier and comes through the Atlanta area, down through Florida, and comes out at Apalachicola Bay. So when you started looking at how low some of these reservoirs and lake levels were in September of 2007, we were already starting to see impacts. I believe at the time, Atlanta was talking about they were, you know, maybe I think it was like 30 days before they were going to run out of water for the city. So, but this had cascading effects. When you don't have water in the headwaters, you're impacting impacting hydroelectric power downstream, irrigation. The southeast Alabama, southwest Georgia areas very heavily dependent on center pivot irrigation, along with rain-fed farmlands. But it also caused problems down Apalachicola Bay because there was no flow coming out of the ACF basin. We were actually seeing increased salinity values, which was killing the oyster industry in Apalachicola Bay. So really being able to track a lot of that precipitation on a more local level, seeing where it rained and hadn't rained was really important to tracking those drought conditions in 2007 and 8. Probably one of my favorite examples of how one person can make a difference. This is a report from Como County, Texas. And it first caught the eye of our team of QA/QC team. That total circled is 7.12, but as you can look, everything around it is less than 1/10 of an inch. And so there was a message that was sent to the observer, just was, make sure they didn't mean like they had put the observation in at 7:12 this morning. They went back and looked at radar, and actually radar confirmed that there was stationary thunderstorm over this area, and it dropped 7 inches of rain. And this is a picture I kind of like to show about it. I mean, this is kind of looking at that idea of how variable precipitation can be. You get under one of those huge, downpours, and you could get a quick 1/4 of an inch where no one else is actually having any rain. So one person, one observation making a huge difference. This is an event that probably scarred me as I lived in Florida during 2008. So Tropical Storm Fay in 2008 made 4 landfalls in Florida along Key West, then along the southwest coast, back on the east coast, and then finally along the Gulf Coast. This storm meandered. It was very slow moving. My house in the Tallahassee area, I measured, I believe it was like 28 inches of rain from this entire event. I watched the water from the water retention pond behind my house slowly rise closer and closer to it. And again, not only with just the data that we see here, but the value that came from the comments, information about power outages that we saw, internet outages, people talking about, previous hurricane seasons and how it related to like 2004, 2005. And these were just daily totals. So 13 inches of rain in one day, 12 inches of rain in one day. And this is kind of just over the Florida area, but Fay had far-reaching impacts even into portions of Georgia and Alabama. Probably one of the most well-known here in South Carolina Valley floods was the October 2015 floods. And this really kind of demonstrated locally the value of having those CoCoRaHS observers. So if we just look at the National Weather Service stations with the ASOS and the co-op, and we look across Charleston County, based on that data, the maximum rainfall that we would have been between 16 and 17 inches. But if we add in the value of the CoCoRaHS data, so the additional observations that we had, we actually had a 4-day total that was measured in Mount Pleasant of 26.88 inches from that particular event alone. That would have been missed had we not had those additional observers to help fill in those gaps. That was a huge event. The flooding extended from the Midlands and the Columbia area down through most of South Carolina. From if you know anything about geography, from like the 20 corridor south, was impacted with that particular atmospheric setup with a stalled front and Joaquin offshore. It just kind of funneled all of that moisture directly into South Carolina from, I believe it was September 30th through October the 6th, causing devastating floodings, multiple, I think hundreds of small dam failures in the Midlands. But having those additional observations was extremely important in doing the analysis. So we go from having an extremely wet event in 2015 to actually going back into drought. And I mentioned that in 2007, we were actually looking at those observations. So there was a push to take those observations and really create a condition monitoring tool where we could look at the, what more did the the observers have? Could they talk about the conditions that they've been living at for a long period of time and give us kind of insight? Were the conditions that they saw severely wet? Were they, moderately dry? So 2016 and 17, we ended up in drought again in the southeast, and this is taken from actually October of 2016, when shortly after Hurricane Matthew moved ashore. And you can see the very quick die-off between where we had severely wet conditions in eastern South Carolina and eastern North Carolina versus what we had in, say, like Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia, with the severely wet versus the severely dry conditions. So I just kind of want to highlight a couple of these condition monitoring reports. And one of those reports came from over here in the eastern portion of North Carolina towards Rocky Mount, where they actually talked about the rainfall total, talked about agricultural fields having flooding issues, roads shut down, power outages, schools were closed, the creeks were above normal, animals were evacuating through the rising water. So this is a really good impact report from what we had from the significant rains with Hurricane Matthew. But then if we go over to to Alabama, we're talking about no rain for 24 days, flows, the spring only flows for a little bit, the wildflowers are the worst in years. We've got brown leaves. Wildlife is they're looking for artificial water sources, large forest fires. And so the condition monitoring tool was kind of born out of the idea of not only do the numbers have that value, but the comments that our observers put in also have an extreme amount of value as well. So I'll bring you to Hurricane Harvey. In 2017, this particular observer in Harris County, Neil Bradley, made what are known as significant weather reports on August the 27th and 28th. And that is another feature that's available for our CoCoRaHS observers. So if they have significant water values or rainfall values over a very short duration, they can push these significant weather reports through CoCoRaHS, and they actually go directly to the National Weather Service. And so Neil made a bunch of those reports during that time period. He measured almost 35 inches of rain from Harvey alone. But the fact that he was pushing those significant weather reports and continuing to do those updates gave the National Weather Service in Houston the real-time data that they needed in order to quickly put out flash flood warnings and any other warning and watch criteria that they had for the area. So the value again of just a citizen science weather observer is just, it's vital. I'll take you to one of the more recent events we had here in South Carolina. So September of 2018, shortly after I actually moved to South Carolina, Hurricane Florence moved through. This is an analysis of the rainfall from during that time period. So you can see that there was a very quick kind of taper off from what fell in what we call the PD region to what fell across the rest of the state of South Carolina. I want to bring your attention to that 23.81 inches of rain that is kind of over in the PD area of South Carolina. That was taken by a CoCoRaHS observer who lived in Loris, which is in Horry County, and over that time period. And so what we've done is we've looked at this in more detail, a lot with some of the talk that you guys might hear with like 100-year events or the average return intervals or the annual probability of exceedance. And so we took that, the values that that particular CoCoRaHS observer had during the time period and kind of put that in perspective. So that 4-day total is right about a 1,000-year event. And what that means is that in any given year, there is a 0.1% chance of that event actually occurring. There is no National Weather Service station, unfortunately, in the Loris area. That station closed down years ago. But because of this CoCoRaHS observer, we were able to capture the significant rainfall event. And that rainfall event actually stands as the highest rainfall total from a tropical cyclone or the remnants in South Carolina since 1956. I've kind of highlighted, we have actually 3 stations, a Loris station, with Florence, a station in Pawleys Island from Dorian in 2019, and then also in 2016, so shortly before Matthew, Hermine, we had a station in the Georgetown area that also reported a pretty high rainfall total. So CoCoRaHS has just, it's a really a wealth of information that you can get from just having those people who are interested in reporting weather and be part of the process. So some of the frequently asked questions, who can join CoCoRaHS? Anyone. That's one of the great things about CoCoRaHS. It's a very user-friendly program. You know, I mentioned earlier, I've got some schools across the state that I've helped install rain gauges at, and they use it as part of not only their science standard, but some of the elementary schools are doing it for simple addition and subtraction. Some of the other schools, middle schools, are for higher math, you know, division, looking at graphing. So it's really got a nice little niche. So anyone who's involved and excited about weather can join. Is the data useful? The answer to that is yes. I mean, I feel like I've given a couple examples just recently of how we've been able to use the data locally. And then what do you need to become an observer? And honestly, it's just 4 easy steps. Just you register online with CoCoRaHS. There are training modules online. Some of those are PDFs. They have training videos on the CoCoRaHS YouTube website. Acquire rain gauge. Everybody in CoCoRaHS is, then this is another question, everybody in CoCoRaHS uses the same rain gauge. It's a 4-inch diameter rain gauge. It's available on Amazon. It's also available through some private companies where they have some links on the CoCoRaHS website, including ambient weather and Weather Your Way. The rain gauge runs about $35 to $40 depending on the vendor. And then basically you just get started. You start making those reports, and those reports can start coming in as soon as you have rainfall. You know, one of the things that we talk about is as important as it is to know how much rain fell, you know, those 0 observations are just as important. So we really do stress to make observations even if you haven't gotten those rains, especially in times of drought. And with that, I've actually done my presentation. So if you guys have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer any questions.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Melissa, for joining us today. My name is Meredith Muth. I am a Regional Drought Information Coordinator for the National Integrated Drought Information System, NIDIS. I am one of the 3 organizations that co-host this monthly series along with the National Weather Service and the Southeast Regional Climate Center. This is our question and answer time, so feel free to enter any comments or questions you have about something you heard today, or even climate questions writ large in the region. As was mentioned before by Sandra, we will go ahead and send out a summary and recording and a link that you can share with your networks and colleagues. Before we start questions and answers, I did want to just mention our next webinars on April 12th. We'll be going a little bit more to the coastal side, looking at acidification in the U.S. Southeast. And that will be a presentation from Marine Laboratory in Florida. On May 10th, we're going to hear a little bit more about sea level projections for the Southeast, a really important topic from NOAA. And then just a heads up, we are going to make a switch in our regular presentation time. So instead of on the early in the month, we're moving towards the end of the month to the 4th Tuesdays of the month. And this is in response to a request from some of the participants of this webinar so that we are more in alignment with the outlooks, the predictions created by the Weather Service Climate Prediction Center. And as always, we appreciate any of your feedback and how we can improve this webinar series that has now been going on for over 3 years. There will be a survey that comes up quickly. Feel free to take it if you'd like. I would like to go ahead now and start with the question and answer. But first, I do want to also just, Melissa, that was a tremendous presentation. It was great storytelling. I learned quite a bit about the history. In fact, my husband was in that flood in Fort Collins and talking in particular about the value of the observations. So again, I encourage anyone who is interested and not currently a CoCoRaHS observer, if you'd like to learn more, please follow those easy steps. It's tremendously useful. I'm going to go ahead and Pam, this first question is for you from your presentation. Can you speak to hay harvesting in the southeast?
Well, I mean, they do a lot of hay harvesting, of course, in the summer when it's warmer, but this year we've been able to have some production, although it's been so dry that a lot of the fields are just kind of sitting there and not really doing a lot of growth. That will change quickly as we really get into the heart of the growing season. But there is a lot of hay production that's done for the local beef and dairy industries, and so when you don't have that production, then you got to, if you don't have forage, especially, which they're not having this year because it's been so dry, they have to use more of that hay. And in the worst cases, for example, in the drought in 2016, they had to import hay from as far away as Missouri. And so that's, an important consideration.
Great, thank you. I have a couple of questions now for Melissa regarding her CoCoRaHS presentation. The first one is, and Melissa, I am putting it also in the chat so you can see what's coming next. How did the one observational difference that you've shown impact decisions or analysis of the drought?
The one observational difference. So I'm gonna guess that was towards the one with the 7 inches of rain, that observational difference. I can't talk to that one, but what I will talk to is, looking at, so I think Matthew would probably be one of the best examples, like here in South Carolina. 2016 and 17 we were already in drought conditions, and then when Matthew came through in 2016, being able to determine where the heaviest rain fell, where we started to have that taper off effect, really helped the local, the state drought declaration here in South Carolina for them to back off on some of the water restrictions that had been issued in certain areas. So having that more detailed information and instead of the 1 point or no information whatsoever from some of our counties, they were able to quickly determine whether or not they could reduce some of the water restrictions in some of those areas. So, in October of 2016, we were flooding in the PD, and then shortly later, after I believe it was in November of 2016, we had one of the biggest fires in the upstate, the Pinnacle Mountain Fire, and that area was still under water restrictions because of that difference. The flash drought that we had here in 2019, which is just fall 2019, having the information about where Dorian tracked in September was also kind of vital. When it moved through portions of the PD, we don't have a lot of National Weather Service stations in that area, so having that CoCoRaHS data was able to also help us do that quick designation in the counties of where we could reduce some of the water restrictions and mandates, and where we needed to keep those in place.
Hey Meredith, this is Todd from the Southeast River Forecast Center, and I can address in addition to what she's saying, because all of that is true. And we have hourly gauges that we quality control our radar to, but at the end of the day, we check everything and we bring in all of those CoCoRaHS stations in areas where we don't have good coverage. And it makes a huge difference in how we do river forecasting on a daily basis, and then over even a longer period of time. So a lot of the graphics that you see on here that are impacted, the graphics for the past rainfall are impacted by those CoCoRaHS stations. So from a climatology standpoint, they're so helpful in those graphical interfaces that you're seeing. If we didn't have those, they wouldn't be nearly as accurate as they are. And those are used in for drought monitor, for all those different things. So they're just a huge benefit to each of the river forecast centers, and then to all over the country for both river forecasts and for climatology.
Thanks for adding that, Todd. That's a really important point. Melissa, I have a few more questions for you.
Okay.
Is there a formal system for letting observers know that they have impacted the forecast or the official record?
So I don't believe that there is a formal system. I know when I was a CoCoRaHS coordinator in Florida and here in South Carolina, I would reach out to the observers and let them know that we're using their information, or if there was a question about their information. There was an event that happened when I was still a Florida coordinator. It happened in, I believe it was June of 2012. We had an observer in the Pensacola area who recorded an extraordinary amount of rain and reached out to her to get more details. I mean, she gave such a detailed comment, but to reach out to her to talk to her about that particular rainfall amount, because it was very close to the 24-hour record rainfall amount that we had in the state at that particular time. When we had the observations come in from Loris, I reached out to that observer again to talk to them. They were more than happy to share their information and even provide more detailed information than what they could put in those comments when we looked at that. And I know Weather Prediction Center, David Roth up at the Weather Prediction Center does a climatology of tropical rain, and he updates that based on each year when we have tropical cyclones impact the United States, if there is a higher total. And I know that the Florence totals, not only for South Carolina but North Carolina, both came from the highest rainfall amounts came from CoCoRaHS observers, and those have been updated. CoCoRaHS observers have been really influential. There are a couple of state records for snowfall and precipitation that have come from CoCoRaHS observers and have been recently reviewed by the National Centers for Environmental Information state climate extremes committees. And we do reach out to those observers when we're going through that process.
Excellent. Next question for Melissa. Does a CoCoRaHS station require 365 days of daily monitoring?
I think the comment I'd like to make the most about that is we definitely would like 365 days, but we realize that not everyone is married to their rain gauge. And so there is a mechanism within CoCoRaHS to do a multi-station or multi-day report. And so that's really helpful, especially with like the schools. No one's going to be there on the weekends to record rain, but they can come on a Monday morning, look at how much rain fell in the rain gauge and tell us that, 2.2 inches fell, since Friday morning. And that was one of the things that was kind of nice about CoCoRaHS in itself, is the ability for us to take those accumulated rainfall totals over multiple days. People go on vacation, things come up, they might miss a day, but instead of that data being lost to the record, that we're still able to use that.
And the last question is, can you share the Amazon link for the CoCoRaHS rain gauge? I can go ahead and put it into the email recap, but if you have it handy, you can certainly put it into the chat as well.
I have one I'm going to actually send to Meredith. I don't know if you want to put that out to everybody. So there's the link for the Weather Your Way company. They are currently offering the CoCoRaHS rain gauge for $33, and then I believe shipping. You may have to pay a little bit for shipping, and I will pull up the link for the Amazon rain gauge. But these rain gauges, that was one of the sticking points for some people is, the rain gauge is a little expensive, but at the same time, I've had my rain gauge for, oh gosh, I had my rain gauge for about 11 years before I needed to replace it. It's a high capacity rain gauge. It can hold up to 11 inches of water. It's not like one that you can buy at Home Depot. And so you take good care of it, you clean it properly, and it can last you for an extended time out in the elements. And I believe Meredith has shared those links, and I just shared the Amazon link, Meredith, with you.
Oh, great. I was on mute. So and with that, I think I'll go ahead and just wrap it up and thank all of our presenters today, both Melissa Griffin as well as Todd Hamill, Pam Knox, and Sandra Rain for their time in pulling this all together and sharing this with you, and I hope you can join us next month. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your day.